When most of us hear the word permaculture, we instantly picture what? Herb spirals? Organic tomatoes? Maybe a couple of backyard chickens roaming around. But beneath the soil of those everyday agricultural techniques lies something way deeper. It's actually a radical, and sometimes pretty controversial, socio-political framework, one that completely challenges how we interact with the world and, honestly, with each other. Welcome to The Explainer. Practitioner Pandora Thomas absolutely hits the nail on the head here. She points out that because we really haven't translated these principles enough for social care, we've ended up with this massive misconception. Permaculture, at its very heart, it isn't just about farming. It's about relationships. It's about looking at those massive, tangled, systemic problems and finding whole system solutions. So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to start with Beyond the Garden Bed, then tackle the escapist delusion. After that, we'll dive into Adjust Sustainability, Evolving the Third Ethic, and wrap up with Decolonization and Collective Healing. All right, Part 1, Beyond the Garden Bed and the Three Ethics. To really understand the paradigm shift permaculture asks of us, we've got to establish the baseline rules of the framework first. First up is earth care. Now, this is the foundational principle, right? It focuses entirely on maintaining the biophysical integrity of our ecosystems. We're talking about restoring damaged landscapes, conserving resources, and making absolutely sure that our human harvest never degrades the environment. It's that classic green part of permaculture we're all pretty familiar with. But building directly on that, we get to people care. This ethic basically demands that our designs actively support the physical, intellectual, and social needs of humanity. It's born from this deep recognition that, well, you simply can't have a healthy ecology if the humans living inside it aren't deeply empowered, fundamentally healthy, and supported by a vibrant community. And finally, we have fair share. This is the highly debated third ethic. This principle mandates recycling surplus energy, food, and capital to support the first two ethics. Basically, it asks practitioners to voluntarily limit their own consumption and distribute any excess equitably. But as you'll see in just a moment, the interpretation and the actual execution of this third ethic is where things get incredibly complicated. Which brings us to Part 2, the escapist illusion and critiques of the movement. The really crucial question we have to ask ourselves here is, how well are people care and fair share actually being implemented in the real world? Well, according to researchers like Dr. Benjamin Habib, the reality on the ground is heavily skewed toward this highly individualized rural ideal. A lot of practitioners view permaculture as, a way to buy a remote plot of land, go entirely off the grid, and just escape the mainstream capitalist system altogether. But by isolating themselves in that kind of utopian bubble, they're effectively starving the movement of any real systemic social impact. Dr. Habib impartially reports on what he calls the self-inflicted wounds of the movement. He points out that retreating from mainstream urban systems is essentially a dead end for true economic regeneration. Because think about it, if you just check out of society and grow veggies in the woods, you aren't actually challenging the broader, unjust structures of the global economy. You're just seeking personal refuge rather than building collective resilience. And this exact criticism is actively echoing from within the community itself. Take a look at this quote from a permaculture forum. Practitioners are starting to call out the inherent privilege of using the philosophy mostly for consulting gigs, online sales, and personal money-making ventures. There's this growing frustration that a framework literally preaching global survival and community is so often restricted by hyper-individualistic practices. So let's look at Part 3, Adjust Sustainability and Politicizing Permaculture. Let's move to a corrective framework and see how we might actually bridge this massive gap between social theory and political action. Julian Aguiaman's Just Sustainability framework brilliantly addresses this tension. The source material argues that we really have to move away from apolitical permaculture, which, let's be honest, often relies entirely on private land ownership and hyper-individual projects. Instead, Just Sustainability argues that environmental initiatives literally must integrate social justice to be effective at all. You just cannot separate environmental sustainability from human equity.
The sources suggest we need to fully acknowledge that agricultural practices actively shape and respond to political systems. Growing food and designing ecosystems, they aren't just cute reflections of personal beliefs. They are inherently political acts. They're dictated by who actually has access to land, capital, and clean environments. Essentially, your garden is a microcosm of the wider political world.
By adopting Just Sustainability, the movement can finally push past just individual gardening. It means redirecting our focus toward community-oriented action.
supporting local food sovereignty, and directly tackling those huge inequities in land ownership. It's about taking that core permaculture principle of use and value diversity and applying it not just to plant life, but to uplifting marginalized human voices and ideas.
Moving on to part 4, evolving the third ethic, redefining the goal. To match this much deeper political awareness, the actual language used to describe the third ethic has evolved pretty dramatically over time. And words matter, right? Tracing this evolution, we can see the ethic mature significantly. Way back in 1988, co-founder Bill Mollison originally framed it as setting limits to population and consumption, which understandably drew heavy criticism for its controversial overtones. It was later reinterpreted as fair share, putting the focus more on resource redistribution. But today, we're seeing a powerful shift toward future care, bringing a deep, human-centric focus on community survival and legacy. Derived from indigenous knowledge and championed by groups like the African Permaculture School, Future Care is a really profound reimagining. It challenges practitioners to look way beyond just physical resources like water and soil, and carefully consider the actual social legacy they leave behind. It asks a tough question: what social tools are we giving the next generation so they can adapt to a rapidly changing world? And that brings us to part 5, decolonization and collective healing. This is the deepest core of our explainer today, looking at how practitioners are actively using this concept of future care to heal systemic harms. Teacher Sylvia de Blasio captures this perfectly. She explains that if we truly want to decolonize the movement and society as a whole, we can't just change behaviors. We actually have to change the foundational stories that have historically made inequality, oppression, and marginalization seem acceptable. It's about undoing the narratives that tell us certain people or certain landscapes are just disposable. To see this in action, the sources highlight the incredible work of reparationist and permaculture practitioner Asia Dorsey. She impartially applies this third ethic by redistributing financial resources, explicitly addressing the historical harms of colonialism, and pushing for land rematriation, things like converting privately owned wealth into community land trusts. For her, fairness isn't just about dividing a pie equally today. It's asking who actually had the pie yesterday and whose house that pie is currently sitting in. Ultimately, practitioners like Rhonda Baird note that this entire process is about undoing toxic inherited patterns. If permaculture is genuinely about designing resilient systems, well, true resilience requires us to heal personal, intergenerational, and historical traumas. The real goal of the third ethic is to do all this heavy social lifting right now, so that future generations literally have less of that trauma to carry. So as we wrap up this explainer, we've seen that permaculture is vastly more than just an agricultural technique. It's really an invitation to redesign our entire social reality. Knowing that true ecological resilience is literally impossible without collective healing, equity, and justice, how will you redesign your own community for future care?